time? I'm here to put a stop to that. I'm standing in a boat. Now, you know this story is off to a bad start because I'm standing in a boat. I'm standing in a boat in a lake in South Carolina, and I'm slowly drifting away from the bank, okay? There's only about 5 or 6 feet between me and the bank, and the water's only about 2.5 feet deep, but there's no oars in the boat, so I can't get back to the bank. And I'm working on this little independent feature film, and the entire cast and crew has now stopped their work, turned, and are looking at me and laughing their asses off because I may have screamed like a little girl, just a little girl. So I've got about 100 people laughing at me as I float away in this boat, and they're laughing because they don't see the snakes, water moccasins, cottonmouths, poisonous. They bite you, you bleed out. And they're all in the water between me and the bank, and they're all back and forth because they're pissed at me because I moved the boat. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this big guy come running down the bank. And when I say big, I mean 6'7", 300 pounds of solid muscle, runs down into the snakes, into the water, comes out, picks me up out of the boat like we're honeymooners, and he's taking me across the threshold, deposits me on the bank, goes back and gets the boat, and that is how I met King Alexander Tubbs. King and I were production assistants, the lowest of the low, on this indie, hip-hop, gangsta, action, independent movie being shot in New York and South Carolina. I was a 23-year-old snot-nosed film geek, and he was a 43-year-old Vietnam vet. And we became friends because we were the outcasts on this particular crew. I was the only white guy on an all-African-American cast and crew. Nobody was particularly mean to me. They just ignored me, which was kind of a lesson in itself about being alone in a crowd. But King was a little different. King was what some people would call a little slow. He was a local South Carolina guy that they had picked up to do manual labor. And if directions had more than 2 or 3 steps, King could get a little lost. He always wore a white dress shirt buttoned all the way up to the top, long sleeves, completely buttoned. This is South Carolina in July. 100 degrees in the shade, 2,000% humidity. Every day he'd wear it, no matter how filthy it got, no matter how late we worked, he would take it home. His sister would wash it, dry it, press it, and he'd wear it the next day. King rubbed a lot of the New York crew the wrong way. He had an eye that would kind of move around on its own. So when he was talking to you, one eye was looking someplace else. And he always had this great big grin on his face. And on a 6'7", 300-pound body of a god, African-American guy, it just kind of incongruous. It didn't fit. And some of the crew just didn't like it. So they'd make fun of him. They'd call him names. They'd make messes for him to clean up. It was real like junior high cafeteria bullshit. You know what I'm saying? Never bothered King. He never had a bad word to say for anybody. Always happy, always pleasant, glad to be there. One of the producers, and I say producers in quotes, you heard that, right? Producers, because there were like 20 of them on this particular film, and nobody knew what they really did. They mostly just sat around, ate the food, and slowed down the work. One of the producers was a guy named Andre. And Andre took particular issue with the way King would say, yes, sir, and no, sir, whenever he was asked a question. So one day, Andre got into his face, or he would have if he wasn't 5'5". Andre was this little guy, but he's going right up on King, and he's poking him and calling him names and saying, you're cooning and acting like a darky, and King's just looking at him like, what are you talking about? And Andre takes a swing at him, and King just kind of ducks it. And then he takes this big hand, this baseball mitt-like hand, and puts it on Andre's shoulder and just steps him back. Now, Andre can't move. He's swinging and yelling and screaming. And King's just looking at him like he's got this interesting little bug. eventually Andre just lost the steam and went off. And that was just one of the weird things that happened on this shoot. Indie films are weird to work on. This was particularly weird. And some of that may have had to do with the fact that it was partially financed by what they used to refer to as toot money, which is what happens when a coke dealer makes so much money that they can't spend it, launder it, or hide it, so they put it into things like gallery openings and independent feature films. So all of these people sitting around on this film with nothing to do, it was bound to get into trouble. One day they decided they wanted to see King without his shirt on. They asked him, he said no. They ordered him, he said no. They offered him money, he said no. Finally, they got one of the guys in the crew to tell him that it was union rules, that if you worked so many hours over 100-degree heat, you had to take off your shirt. Now, King was a rule follower, never wanted to break the rules, so he took off his shirt. His chest and his back were covered in long, deep, trench-like scars. His entire torso looked like it was a 3D map of the Rocky Mountains. There were places where it looked like somebody had just cut pieces out of the muscle. It was so awful to look at that they begged him to put his shirt back on. A couple of days later, I was in the production office doing paperwork with Andre and the production coordinator, and everybody on the crew was curious as to where the scars came from. King's sister shows up to pick up his pay, and the production manager, under the guise of asking about King's health, asked him where the scars came from. She said that when King came back from his second tour in Vietnam, he was very excited because he was going to re-up and go into officer training. So when he got off the bus, he was wearing his full dress uniform with a big chest full of medals. And he walked right through the center of that town and all the way home. And everybody in the town saw him. Now, a couple people in that town started thinking that King thought he was better than everybody else because of his medals. So one night they grabbed him coming out of a roadhouse, knocked him out, dragged him to the woods, and beat him with a chain and whipped him with a length of barbed wire and left him there for dead. He had a brain hemorrhage that popped his eye right out of the socket. And the only reason he was still alive was a farmer saw some buzzards circling and came out to see if something had gotten after one of his calves and found him still tied to the tree 2 days later. Now, as I'm listening to this story in that little cottage, I'm looking across the table at Andre, and Andre's crying. He's weeping. The tears are rolling off his cheeks, and the snot is coming out of his nose and dripping off his chin. And he sees that I see him, and he curls up into a little ball and sobs so hard his entire body was shaking. They fired me the next day. The production manager said I hadn't done anything wrong, but it's just a good rule of thumb to never let your boss know that you've seen him crying. I understand that after that, King, every job they gave King came with a chair, some shade, and a glass of lemonade. Now, I don't know if there's any kind of moral to this story. I don't know if there's anything we can learn from this, but I do know that when you tell a story, the story becomes part of all the people who heard it. And now my friend King, who saved me from the snakes, is all part of you too. Thank you.